Space. We are now back here on Ways and Means. It is still Tuesday. It's still the 16th. And we are going to start our conversation about the education fund. I'm hoping we sort of talked through the outlook in some depth multiple times. We talked a little, we talked last week about why we think we are seeing these spending pressures in the education fund. We sort of got our head around that side of the problem. And today we are going to spend some deep time with Julia reviewing a report that she worked on, a few other pieces around essentially like, what are the policy solutions writ large that are available to us to do something about the tax rate as projected. I want to be clear that these are not my policy recommendations. They are not Joint Fiscal's policy recommendations. These are just policy theories that are like available in the universe to make a difference, because we need to sort of be clear on all possible options and levers given sort of what we are tackling here on behalf of Vermonters. Does that all make sense? I know often when I bring something up, it is interpreted both by the wider world and by people in this committee as like something I want to do. That is not what's happening right now. We are just talking about what is possible, abstractly possible, not politically possible. Okay? Great. With that, Julia, thank you so much for being with us. And this Ed Fund Outlook is not a change from last week. It's just so that we always have it in front of us. Welcome.
Thank you. For the record, I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. Madam Chair, would you like me to just dive on in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Thank sure. You. And share my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That works for you?
Yes, happy to. So, for folks looking to pull it up on their own devices or watching at home, there are two documents posted on the committee page under my name. And the one that I've got pulled up here, the slide deck, Understanding the Levers in Vermont's Education Fund. So, this outline of these slides is really threefold. First, we're going to do a general review of the Ed Fund and general levers. And then second, talk about a couple sections of the 2023 report on Vermont's education financing. This was a report that was required in Act 127 for Joint Fiscal to look at a few things from the literature. So we'll talk about Vermont's education costs and potential options for cost containment. And then also talk about some mechanics for setting the yield. So I'll talk about that in more detail when we get there. And then finally, thinking about the other lever, which is revenue going into the education fund. So the considerations when thinking about revenue going into the education fund and what example levers may look like.
And I don't know if I said this last week, but just sort of something that's helping me get my thoughts straight about all of this is the idea that there are like short, medium, and long-term solutions on a spectrum, and there are spending and revenue options on a continuum. And for whatever reason, that little matrix is helping me get there. I don't know if that helps anyone else, but I'm offering to. I will not put on whiteboard does. So starting out, just big picture review of the Ed Fund, the things that are, I think, worth keeping in mind, especially when considering these slides, is that the funding formula distributes money to schools using this statewide Ed Fund. We'll recall that each year property tax rates are set to ensure that education expenditures are fully funded. So it means that the amount of revenue that's raised is driven by total expenses, not the other way around, like what we see in the general fund. And because of this structure of the Ed Fund, there's multiple factors that impact property tax bills. And these are sort of the different factors we'll be diving into today. This can be thought of as pushing on the balloon in the sense that
because the education fund is sort of this circular nature, pushing on something over here, inevitably something else is going to pop out, right? So we'll be talking about that in some more detail, and sort of thinking about it in two ways. The factors that impact property bills are two general buckets: expenditures and revenues. So big picture, the expenditure lever that impacts property tax bills. So under current law, we'll recall that education expenditure decisions are made at both the statewide and the local level. So holding all else equal, because of the structure of the ed fund, increasing expenditures means that revenues also need to be increased to ensure that expenditures are fully funded. The converse also being true. Decreasing expenditures means that less money needs to be raised from revenues from property taxes. The other side of the equation, we have revenues. So you'll recall the ed fund is funded from multiple revenue sources. We've got the list of non-property tax revenue sources. And then we've got the property taxes, the homestead and the non-homestead. So again, holding all else equal, if we increase the non-property tax revenues, that decreases the amount that needs to be raised from property taxes. Conversely, decreasing non-property tax revenues or decrease in non-property tax revenue performance means that property taxes need to be increased to make up that difference. And further diving deeper into the different classes of property, you'll recall that property taxes and property tax bills don't need to move uniformly across all three classes. So increasing the amount of revenues that are raised by one property class means a decrease, the converse. So there's flexibility there as well within the property tax calculation.
And we don't have as much discernment on those property tax levers as we might, given that the way our grand list is organized, we really just have a few.
Exactly, yes. So the homestead and the non-homestead, and then the income sensitivity portion with respect to the homestead, we will talk about in greater detail down the line.
Study on that?
I don't think we have a study on that. Thank you.
So before diving more deeply, I do want to reiterate the chair's initial comments and first just outline the report on ed finance. So ed financing, so this was section 19 of Act 127. This is the legislative charge, essentially to look at cost containment methods as well as mechanics for setting the yield in a manner that creates a constitutionally adequate ed spending amount, and viewing this through the lens of funding similar school districts in an equitable manner. So,
and I just want to sort of name, and maybe I shouldn't do it anyway, at the tail end of sort of drafting Act 127 in committee, we, as happens in all committee processes, we really started like any sort of holdout idea anyone had that was giving them a little bit of irksomeness, sort of all somehow went into this report that you wound up drafting, Julia. So thank you for basically like carrying all of our disagreements in the course of this single report. Appreciate it.
sure. Yeah, so these were the three charges for this report. And to further drive the point home that this is all in response to a legislative charge. This is not recommendations from the Joint Fiscal Office regarding cost containment, nor recommendations from JFO with respect to Vermont's ed finance structure. Everything here is based on research and analysis of third-party materials, and so should not be interpreted as recommendations nor guidance. So with that in mind, diving into Vermont's education costs and potential options for cost containment. So this really stems from what's spelled out in the report. So we'll talk a little bit about the background of education costs in Vermont, talk about previous legislative attempts to contain costs, and then lastly, talk about possible options for cost containment. So, is that a good size? Should I make it bigger?
That would be great.
Is that better?
That's lovely, thank you.
Okay. So diving into the background of education costs in Vermont. So this is inflation adjusted dollars to 2020 dollars. Over time, we can see that both the inflation adjusted education payment, is this dark blue line here, and the total uses of the ed fund, the lighter blue line, have slightly increased despite a statewide decline in equalized pupils. We can think about equalized pupils essentially as on average, how many kids are sitting in chairs in school. So what we're seeing here is on the left-hand axis, the millions of dollars, inflation adjusted. That's corresponding with the two lines of the ed payments and the total uses. And then on the right-hand axis, the equalized pupils, and seeing that dotted line of the decrease of equalized pupils over time, over the last 15 years. When we put those together, we can see Vermont's statewide education spending per equalized pupil over time. This is also inflation adjusted. So I do want to note the scale does not start at 0 here, but this is the ed spending per equalized pupil. So you can see when you put the two together, even though there haven't been significant increases in spending, because when coupling that with a decline in pupils, you see increasing statewide ed spending per pupil over time.
But that's education spending, not spending on education.
Correct. So we'll recall that education spending is when we take the school budget, we subtract out offsetting revenues. So we're subtracting out categorical aid, dollars from the federal government, everything that fits into the offsetting revenues, and the remainder there, that's the education spending.
Oh, sorry, Sam's back. Sorry about that.
Any idea what happened in 1819? We show a decrease.
I'm not sure. I would need to look into it.
Did you, Julie, in all these graphs where you're putting up real dollars, were you using the NEEP as the inflation adjustment? Is that
Yes,
the NEEP? Okay, thank you.
because that's what most of Title 16
Right.
spells out as the inflation adjuster.
Okay.
So further diving in deeper, how does Vermont compare to the rest of the country? So generally, the Northeast has higher student expenditures than the rest of the country. I pulled data from the NEA. The most recent data available was 2020 to 2021. We can see that in this most recent data, Vermont was ranked second as the total public school expenditure per student in fall enrollment. In 2001, Vermont was ranked nationally as 8th, so it's now increased to 2nd. And I do want to point out that you can see that the Northeast does have generally higher ranks than the rest of the country. While we're seeing increases in student expenditure over time, this does not necessarily correspond with education performance. So the National Assessment of Education Progress is a national assessment that's used to measure educational achievement. We use this because it is used across the country and it has data from 2005 to 2019, so we can sort of get a sense of what is happening. And we can see that Vermont students' average assessment scores, which is what we're looking at in this chart here, have been relatively steady over time. And this outcome is consistent with the literature that there is no direct linkage between funding and student performance. Further, when comparing Vermont's performance to the national average, the state's performance has not kept pace with other states. So what we're looking at here, this chart is the difference between Vermont's average score and the national average score over time. So in this graph, a positive value means that Vermont's score is higher or was higher than the national average, whereas a lower value means that Vermont's score is lower than the national average.
I'm wondering in the slide on page 12, we're comparing these NAEP scores, but we aren't spending all of the dollars on educating students. We're spending dollars on things that the state is not paying for. So what if we were to pull out, so that we can compare apples to apples, everything that is not directly teaching reading and writing from the per pupil expenditure, and then see, well, what are we spending on mental health care? What are we spending on some other things? You could even imagine that extraordinary special education costs are a health cost or a social, something very extraordinary.
I think it's a really good question. I know that any elementary school teacher I've ever talked to about it would say that you actually absolutely cannot separate out those pieces. That social emotional regulation is learning reading and all those things, but so I worry about us wading into that water, given that the education committee might be better prepared to wade into it, but I think it's a really good point to make. I just don't know if we can make it in a graph. I do think that we do need to dive into some of the some of those questions as we go.
I can see the education committee diving into that, but I can also see that if we're looking for where funding would come from for different kinds of expenses, that might say, well, the general fund of a state should pick up mental health care costs, which would take that out of the education fund.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I think we need to spend a little bit of time figuring out what sort of the path forward for that is with testimony.
Okay.
But back to Julie.
Sure. So that wraps up the brief overview in terms of education costs and spending in the state over the last 15 years or so, and moving into now previous legislative attempts to contain costs. So as I'm sure most of you are aware, cost containment of Vermont's education spending and spending on education has been a continued point of policy discussion. I do want to recall that the increase in ed spending per pupil can largely be attributed to a slight increase in the inflation adjusted ed spending and a more significant decrease in the number of pupils. So the policy measures I'll touch on are Vermont's excess spending adjustment, merging of schools, school districts, and restructuring the funding structure for special education.
What about some of the things we include in Act 127? Like the cap, as far as that's not enough.
So
If that's expense, that's the other side of the equation.
Yeah, that definitely did not contain cost.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
right, so
That's really a number.
So I will talk about, the way that the presentation is kind of structured is like cost containment, what has been done up to Act 127. What are some, according to the literature, other options or other ideas that have been floated around? Then talking about different mechanics of setting the yields, and then getting into other considerations of property tax revenues, and then other considerations of just revenues in the ed fund in general. We're going there.
Yes.
And we did try allowable growth rates in Act 46, and that worked so well that the school districts came in and tried bloody murder and made them take them off.
So is
Try
that
that.
sarcasm?
Yes, but that's actually happened. Remember that, Carolyn? Yeah.
I'm sorry, kind of lost what you just said. Could you just repeat?
I said we tried allowable growth rates and it worked so well that the districts came in January and screamed at us to remove them. And we knuckled under and did it.
Okay. Another one from the list.
Can add that to the list. I won't touch on that today because I'm not prepared to speak to it.
But it did work.
So one measure that I know some members of the committee are aware of is Vermont's excess spending adjustment. So this is written into statute, increases a district's tax rate if it spends above a certain level. So essentially it's creating an additional tax for the amount of a school district's ed spending per equalized pupil that's greater than the excess spending threshold. There's also a list of allowable exclusions. It's calculated annually and based on the statewide average ed spending per pupil in fiscal year 15, increased by inflation, and then multiplied by a percentage factor 121. And then in recent years, the General Assembly has enacted policy to suspend the excess spending adjustment. This suspension started during the COVID years and then was further suspended in Act 127. So currently it's suspended through fiscal year 2029.
And if we have not suspended that, can you describe a little bit about how that would have been a little weird with the implementation of 127?
Sure. So a couple of things. One is just the pure mechanics of it. So the way that the excess spending threshold is calculated currently in statute is this ed spending per equalized pupil. You'll recall that Act 127 eliminates the equalization ratio, so we no longer are using equalized pupils. So mechanically, that's one challenge. And then second, on more of a policy consideration front, you'll recall that Act 127 is adjusting the tax capacity of different school districts. So the excess spending adjustment is essentially saying if you are really increasing your spending, then you're going to be paying a higher premium on the dollars above the excess spending threshold. So if the intent is to increase spending in certain districts, then the excess spending adjustment would sort of go against that intent. There have also been a number of acts over the past 15 years playing roles in merging and consolidating school districts. And so through these mergers, there was a reduction of 156 districts across the state. And according to publications from AOE, the mergers were anticipated to increase schools' ability to share staff, resources, and programs. Another piece of this puzzle was restructuring the funding for special education. Act 173 adjusted the funding of special ed to a census block grant funding model. Under this model, supervisory unions receive a census block grant based on state appropriations for special ed divided by the statewide long-term membership. The previous model reimbursed school districts for actual special ed expenditures incurred. And so I included for context in fiscal year 2023, special ed aid was 208 million, just to have a ballpark in terms of what we're talking about here. It is true that with the census block grant model, this is the categorical aid of special aid that's flowing to school districts. It does not say that a school district can only spend up to this amount for special education in its school, just how much is being received in a categorical aid to the school district.
You have this in the cost containment bucket of the presentation, looking bad at the special ed for the last few years.
A little bit.
You have this in the cost containment side. I'm looking at the line on the ed fund outlook over the last several years. It looks like there has been a growth in that category. Has moving to 173 main cost.
So we're still in the process of moving into Act 173 in the census block grant model. It was suspended for a few years and we're now in a transition phase. I forget the year it's supposed to be finalized. And there are different parts of the special education calculation. There's, I forget the terms for what they are. So long story, extraordinary, thank you.
I always forget that because it seems like not a technical term.
That's what was in my head.
And I always think I'm wrong.
So I'd say, long story short, I don't know. I would defer to AOE if they are able to, how they're able to parse out that data. And it's one of those questions of we don't know what it would have been had Act 173 not been passed, and we don't know where we're going.
But the intent was cost containment, hence inclusion.
And I think one of the things we're going to be digging into is why that didn't work and if it still might work and all of those things. Representative Andrews, but.
I'm sorry, going back, wondering about the screen. Oh,
Thank you.
going back a slide to ask sort of a similar question about school mergers. I mean, it sounds like we were successful in merging districts, but did that save us any money?
So interestingly, there's Representative Spence, would you like to speak to this?
You would.
On behalf, channeling one of my most engaged constituents, AOE was tasked with writing annual reports as a part of Act 46 on just that topic. Were we seeing savings or not? And I'm trying very hard to find the reports for 2020 and 2021. And so if anyone at AOE wants to respond to any of the emails that they have been sent asking about those reports, we might have some of those answers.
Representative Beck?
We don't.
Yeah.
I would just point out that we can't ascertain what the spending in the state of Vermont on special education is by looking at line 11. Line 11 is simply the grants that we give to school districts. It is not how much is being spent by school districts on special education. They're not the same thing.
No, and it's not just line 11. I mean, Julia can talk about it, but there's
Yeah.
even places in the outlook where it's explicitly special education that aren't just line 11. There are other lines in the outlook that would be described as special education other than line 11. Representative Anthony?
And just to clarify, I think I'm right, that figure and other lines refers to state commitments, does not include
Does not include.
the federal funds.
Yes, excellent point.
That's what I thought. I just want to,
Yes, and
So to clarify, the outlook is only talking about state dollars. So when talking about the special education aid line, that's only referencing the state categorical aid.
Commitment.
And then getting to Representative Beck's point that a school district may choose or may need to have additional costs for special education on top of what they're receiving in categorical aid from the state, in which case that will fall into will fall into the education payment line, part of that school district's ed spending.
Oh, sorry.
Is it possible for somebody to flag for us which lines include special ed costs?
Um,
I see like 4 already.
I would like to come back
Okay.
with that.
I think one of the challenges that I'm at least encountering as I try to like get my head around all of this is there's, like, this is how much the education fund is spending. But what that means in terms of sort of the sum of budgets is a very different thing. And we don't have real transparency on that question.
That's quite disturbing.
Well, they've never been able to get that chart of accounts to work the way they want.
So that might be part of our work. Onwards through the slides.
Right. So that goes over, that finishes up the high level previous legislative attempts to contain costs. Are moving into possible cost containment options. Once again, this comes from a review of third-party materials. They've been identified as possible options from a review of the literature, not a policy recommendation. So we'll talk through each of these options: adjusting staffing ratios, encouraging or mandating more mergers, consolidating administrative services, reinstituting or adjusting the excess spending threshold, implementing education spending caps, and or moving ed spending decisions to a statewide level.
And for folks who have come in the room since we began testimony, I just want to put again on the table again that these are neither joint recommendations nor my recommendation as chair. They're not proposals. They are a full comprehensive view of sort of what are possible tools in the wide universe of possible tools. Back to you, Jill.
And so keeping all of those caveats in mind, I also want to note that we're really talking about cost containment because that was the legislative charge, and policymakers may consider impacts beyond cost containment when considering any of these options. But we're really just focusing on cost containment for the purposes of the report. So, starting off with staffing ratios, staffing costs comprise of approximately 80% of public ed expenditures nationally. And those can be thought of as the salaries, benefits, training, and other expenses for all school staff. Intuitively, it's true, the higher the number of personnel per pupil, the higher the per pupil expenditure. And in previous years, multiple entities have discussed staffing ratios in Vermont during education cost containment and funding considerations. So how do we compare nationally? The student to staff ratio is defined as the average number of students per staff member. In the fall of 2020, Vermont had the lowest ratio in the country. So this means the fewest number of pupils per staff in the public school system.
Representative General?
Julie, can I just ask, what's driving that ratio? Is it special ed fund or spending, or is it something else? Shed any light on that?
Sure. So based on the review of the information that was available, it's consistent with other Northeastern states, which all fall below the national average. And this can be attributed, at least in part, to the prominence of small schools, which require minimum staffing levels regardless of the number of students. Beyond that, that would be a question for the field and for schools in terms of the staffing. choices. So we can see that there were, in 2019, which was the most recent available data, from Digestive Education Statistics, which we chose because it presents and collects data across all states, so it makes it for more of an apples to apples comparison. The excuse me, student to staff ratio was 4.4. Also,
Let's let her finish her sentence. You want to finish your sentence?
I was going to move into student to teacher, so if there are questions about student to staff.
Either one, I mean, just point out, I was gonna make it so.
Right, make your point.
Okay, I just point out, being one of the older fellows here, this, staff student ratios when I was younger were very different than they are right now. But I would point out, in case anybody's wondering, that life, I'll go so far as to say life was relatively simple and compared to where it is right now. So apples and apples doesn't work, I don't think. It's interesting. But, I mean, the elementary school, for example, what do we have?
I think the question,
the high-
I'm sorry.
I mean, you get the point anyway.
Okay.
So we had many more students per teacher in classrooms when I was much younger.
I think the question of what the best ratio are for student outcomes is a question we will leave to the education committee. Representative Bodie.
It was just a comment on 20 that, of course, what 21 shows us teacher, student to teacher ratio, but I don't know these other states, what kind of staffing those states are paying for out of their education dollars, even if it's just based locally. Are they paying for, I don't know what they're paying for versus what we are making our schools pay for. Or that we're not paying for on a state level, so the schools are picking it up. So that I can't see as.
Representative Beck.
Yeah, I just say the last time we took somebody took a real stab at going through staffing ratios and considered it as a cost containment option. Staffing ratios weren't correlatable to anything. Size districts, size schools, nothing. It was just basically district choice. There was no correlation.
Representative.
Wasn't.
I want to go back mentally to one of the earlier observations you made, namely, much of what is driving the situation we hear now was the decline of students. And what I'm wondering is whether or not that decline, which has been going on for a while, was or represents people moving through a school, that is to say kindergarten and first grade started to go down, and so then third grade, fourth, and so on as people move through, or there's literally periods where there were wholesale shifts no matter the grade level. I say that because if it were people moving through the school system, one could or should expect the local folks to have foreseen that moving through the school. If it's a jump down, then it's a surprise, or even if it becomes systemic. And I'm just trying to get my head around if that's what's driving why we're here, trying to figure out if this is a progressive process moving through the grades, or if something more dramatic going on that's unanticipatable. But I can't tell from the data what's going on.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question in terms of demographics and how the student population has changed over time. We have seen a decline in the number of pupils in the school system. Now, why that is or how that compares to the rest of the state, I can't speak to. I will say that Joyce Manchester, the senior economist at JFO, published this winter, I guess, a demographics issue brief that's looking at how different cohorts have changed in Vermont over time. I can certainly forward that to you.
Yeah, would you?
Yeah.
Because might be, give a window between the age 0 to 5 and 5 to 15 and
Julia, would you send that to me as well? That sounds super interesting.
Can you send it to us, Rachel?
That's a good
Yes.
idea. Thank you.
thanks.
Yeah.
Representative
Well, the federal and state mandates on local school boards take so much of their decision-making power away from them. They don't say, oh, I know, we'll do this new program in X. No, they're told, here's a mandate, there's insufficient funds for it. And now, thank you very much. I will take your federal mandate, as wonderful as it may be, to provide special education services. And you promise, the federal government promised 40% to pay 40% of those costs. I don't even think they're at 10% yet. And they're at 7 or something, maybe lower. And then we say, well, the schools are choosing. No. The schools have a mandate. They have to provide the services. It's not a bad idea to provide these services. Nice idea. But it doesn't come with enough money to provide them. Thus, the school board doesn't have some choice about what it's going to be spending at the local level. So I just have to say that.
Thanks, Karen. We have 21 slides, a lot to learn.
And snow falling.
Snow falling, I'm not sure how that, I guess that fits into it for the travelers one. And like an hour and a half left, maybe. So I do want us to dig in. I just wonder if, when possible, not asking questions on every slide, but stating questions or comments for the, and as we go through.
And I do want to also add that I guess I should have sent this to Sorcia as well. I will send this. These slides pull like the big headlines from the report for the purposes of this testimony. And there's a lot more detail, resources, and all of the citations available in the report that also help to dig in deeper. So I will send that to Sorcia in case you're interested. So moving into student to teacher ratio, same idea. Student to teacher ratio is the average number of students enrolled per teacher. And we can see also using the latest available data that Vermont had the second lowest student to teacher ratio in the US in 2020 to 2021. So 10.1 pupils enrolled per teacher. That was second to New Hampshire, which was 10 pupils enrolled per teacher. So another potential way to adjust pupil to staff ratios and contain costs is through further merging of supervisory unions, school districts, and our schools. Ultimately, while Vermont has a unique and rural landscape, the number of districts and supervisory unions is a policy decision that could be adjusted. There was a legislative report published in 2016 that said in Vermont, with scores of schools, school mergers could produce significant cost savings.
I know you've asked this, Mike. Can't help us. I mean,
It wasn't don't comment, it was just like, figure out a monitoring.
this slide is based on the premise that there is cost containment and savings that happens with merging. Until we have definitive reports proving that, that seems to me like conjecture more than fact.
Well, it was conjecture from Picus, who is sort of one of the foremost educational researchers in the country. He's come to the committee a number of times. We can certainly things done on this issue. So I just want to be clear, it's not Julia's conjecture.
Oh, I understand.
It is someone else's conjecture. Yes, Representative.
And district consolidation was only expected to save $15 million. 15. It wasn't like a big, what they're talking about here, in some cases, is building consolidation. I had nothing to do with Act
I think he
46.
said 15. Did he say 15 or 50?
15.
And what did they think building?
Chump change these days.
Well, Act 46 wasn't a building consolidation bill, it was a district consolidation bill.
Which is a big difference,
Totally different animal.
especially in the context of this. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And yes, this is all review of the literature, not my own takes. Another possible option based on the literature is to encourage or mandate school districts to consolidate administrative activities. There was in 2004 a joint legislative education cost containment study committee. I'm not sure if any of you were around then. In case you were not, the intent of the committee was to encourage school districts to consolidate across these different services. And AOE needed to publish a report and cited that the anticipated consolidation would lead to this increased ability to share staff, et cetera, and potentially lead to cost containment. Another possible cost containment option would be to implement education expenditure caps. Other states have enacted K through 12 spending caps on different services, which include special education and administrative and support services. So in Vermont, the special education spending is capped at the state level with respect to that categorical aid we were speaking about earlier. This is a funding cap in categorical aid, but in theory, as Rep. Beck, you mentioned earlier, school districts could spend more and make up their difference in education spending. Some other states also cap expenditures on administrative and support services.
Okay.
Another possible option would be to strengthen the understanding and connection between school budget votes and the property tax bill. Some stakeholders have critiqued Vermont's education property tax system for its complex connection between budget votes and property tax liability. So the idea here being that if the connection between school budget votes and the overall liability were more clear to voters, then perhaps that would lead to a tighter connection between voter decisions regarding local budgets and cost containment actions at the local level.
Going deeper on that question, are there ideas about how to actually strengthen that connection?
None that I'm prepared to speak to today.
We passed it out of the House in 2018.
Yes.
I mean, yeah. There are ways to do it.
Maybe we could, at some point in the next few weeks, take some time for a post to actually understand what that looks like. Okay. Back to our slides, thank you.
And lastly, would be to restructure education spending decisions or spending on education decisions to a statewide level. So as we're aware, under current law, every school district ultimately determines the amount that should be spent on public education. While the previously presented options may create some cost containment, there still will be determination at the local level in terms of spending decisions. So another manner to contain costs would be to restructure the ed finance system so that education spending decisions are made at the state level instead of the local level. And as we're aware, this would create significant change both culturally and fiscally and would require further analysis.
Representative Sims.
I'm surprised that there isn't like intermediary option that someone is doing around, especially because I guess we did put it in 127. So before we either make all the decisions at the statewide level, or we can have more review and technical assistance and support. Is that something that you know,
I guess
that like
I'll
sort of
offer, so we
there's like
have,
the
yeah.
spending threshold, you get penalized, or we make decisions elsewhere, but more of a back and forth about drafts and feedback on those draft budgets.
So in 127, there's the tax rate review board that the Agency of Education is working towards standing up right now. And the way it's drafted in statute in 127 is that anyone who goes essentially over 10% is subject to the tax rate review board. I think one of the levers that we have available to us this session even is to say that anyone who passes sort of the 5%, anyone who's experiencing that 5% cap would go before the tax rate review board. And that might be one that might us actually just help collect the data that we need to understand what is happening. There would be an opportunity for greater oversight and deeper conversations, like that kind of technical assistance you described. The capacity to provide that assistance does not seem to be immediately present. And so I wonder sort of what it would mean to respond quickly to that kind of need. Because the tax rate review board is actually made up of existing school staff, like business managers who have full-time jobs already. So that's definitely a question, but that's sort of one other thing we can talk more about when we get to that section of your presentation.
Sure, and if I may, I would also add that I appreciate the question because it gets to the point that this may not be an exhaustive list, right? There may be a number of other policy ideas and considerations that are not included in the report and in the slide deck. And that's really a function of limited resources, limited staff time available to writing these reports.
And if anyone in this room or outside of this room has any ideas for ways we can reduce spending while making sure that our kids and teachers and staff are really, having their needs met, there are lots of opportunities to list those. Please, yeah. Representative Bryan.
I just want to say I may be off the wall here because I'm only now looking at this report. Unfortunately, I didn't read it before class, but the changes we've made, the attempt to reduce spending over the last, what is we're looking at here, 7 years, 6 years, have only, the only impact we've had is to reduce student performance. We have not reduced spending, especially in special ed.
I mean,
So
I think
I'm not anxious to make any changes and out of the fear of reducing student performance further.
I think we need to be really careful in how we collaborate with the education committee and the field on this, because I want us to be careful about correlation and causation. There are a lot of other global problems that have happened over the last decade that we're looking across that we're not going to be able to account for. We don't know how things might have been worse or better if we hadn't acted, and we're not going to be able to figure that out given the limited data we have to look backwards. But I do think we have to be really careful how we proceed, because I agree there are things we've done that have had sort of the opposite effect that we intended.
I share the puzzlement and care before we proceed, and I'll tell you why. Again, in my other life, when I was on government ops, we had to deal with the pension crisis, and one of the things that emerged was a sort of very contrary fact to what we're hearing about today, namely the exodus of teachers from the profession, unanticipated, early, unpredicted, et cetera, which produced the problems that I was participating in curing. But the surprising thing is, if the workload was such that people were saying, I got to get out of here, and yet we have the lowest student-teacher ratio, is something I'm not picking up on. And it's very disturbing because you move one lever and you might inadvertently make things more difficult. for progress and success. So that's what was on my mind when I heard about this low ratios where they're leaving. Why?
Okay, let's talk about the yield.
Okay, yeah, really switching gears.
So we talked about costs and now we're talking about how we find the money for those costs.
Thank you. Yes. So switching yields to this,
You're
yields.
welcome to like take some water, drink some water or something.
No, this is great. Switching mindset now to thinking about the second legislative charge in Act 127 to be included in this report, which has to do with the mechanics for setting the yields. So we're moving away from the cost containment conversation to talk more about the revenue side of things now and how taxes and the ed fund work together. So we'll talk about some overview and background, some general policy considerations, and then some more specific options for adjusting the yield. So this was the legislative charge. It was for JFO to examine the inclusion of a constitutionally adequate education spending amount for school districts at a level determined by ed fund experts to be sufficient to meet student needs. So it's outside of the scope of the report to say, what is that amount? And so to talk more generally in terms of what would that look like in the funding structure and how the funding structure would need to change accordingly. So again, not policy recommendations, response to legislative charge. So taking a step back in terms of structuring our thinking, what is a base amount per pupil? 29 states have an education funding formula that includes some sort of base amount per pupil. And essentially, it's the minimum guaranteed dollar per pupil that the state provides to a school district. It's not synonymous with the total amount of education spending per pupil, how much is being spent to educate kids. It's basically saying this is the bare minimum. Beyond that, I'm not going to speak too much to the way that other states do it because Vermont's ed funding formula is so unique. So Vermont's funding formula, as we know, does not include a formal base amount per pupil. Instead, it has a minimum base property tax of $1 and a minimum base income education tax of 2%. So we can kind of think that because there are these base tax rates, the homestead property yield serves as sort of an informal base amount per pupil spending for a school district, right? Because if a school district has spending per pupil below the yield, it still is going to have a tax rate of $1. So it can spend below the yield and it will have the same tax rate regardless of if they were to spend up to the yield.
And I have a vague memory that I would love your help with, which I'm sorry if you also have a vague memory of this, maybe other people on the committee remember this. But when we were working on 127, discovering that there are actually districts that do spend below what the dollar yield would be, it shocked me. Not that I see any districts behaving that way this year, but.
I don't remember it enough to speak to it.
Scott, do you remember that?
I remember some districts that spent below the income yield, but not the property yield. And to some degree, they're leaving money on the table, but I don't remember anybody spending less than the property yield, but maybe I just don't remember.
Thought Barry was one time. You joked to me.
I think they were below the income yield, but not the
okay.
property yield.
Okay.
I could be wrong. I don't know.
And they're able to do that.
Yeah.
That's why we're referring to it as an informal base. It's not saying you got to spend this much. It's just when thinking from my economics training, $1 rate is going to get you up to this much. So
Maybe.
And, when there sort of is money left on the table, that might be sort of the individual actor of the district might be making what seems like an irrational decision. However, the cost of the education fund overall come back on each and every one of us and each district. And so it's interesting how this sort of relationship between the district and the town and the statewide education fund, I think that many districts sort of lose track of their place in the bigger picture and are rather sort of acting as individual rational actors rather than rational actors as part of a wider system. But we're going to talk about that so much more in the next few weeks. Back to you, Julia.
Okay. So when thinking about including a base amount per pupil, regardless in terms of the structure, there's a few general considerations that are worth raising. So first of all, Vermont's pupil weights and funding formula, this is both pre and post Act 127, adjust a district's tax capacity. They're not adjusting the amount of education spending or the amount that a school district is receiving. That's how pupil weights are working within our system. School districts may already be meeting the spending level deemed constitutionally adequate by experts. We don't know what that level is. Changing the structure of the homestead property yield may impact the income yield and the non-homestead rate. That gets back to that question of pushing on the balloon that we were talking about on the first or the second slide. Further, the current ed finance system requires that revenue adjustments are made to sufficiently fund expenditures. So adjustments to the yield may result in adjustments necessary elsewhere. And finally, inclusion of a formal base amount may not necessarily align with cost containment strategies, dependent on the base amount and how it fits in. So all of those are laid out and discussed in further detail in the report, but I'll just close there. And talk about options for setting the yields to include this constitutionally adequate base amount. So we know that currently the ed funding system requires a mechanism that can be adjusted to ensure sufficient revenues are raised to fund expenditures. I know I keep saying that, and it's important in each one of these sections to keep that in mind, that the two are so inherently linked in the system. So if the yield becomes fixed, then a new mechanism would be needed to ensure that sufficient revenues are raised. The report identified two general methods for how Vermont's ed finance system could be adjusted to include this specific spending amount. And again, these are high-level options and do not account for the size of the base amount. And so, of course, the size and scope of the base amount would introduce additional considerations. So the first big option one would be to include a formal base amount per pupil in statute. This would serve essentially as a floor for education spending per weighted pupil and could be set at a level determined by experts to be adequate. This would be different from the current formula because it creates an explicit spending floor, not the current system, which has that explicit tax rate floor. And there's several options this way could be structured. I titled them 1A, 1B, and 1C just because we're all within the world of option one. So in this option, set a formal base amount per pupil in statute. School districts could still spend above the minimum base amount and their tax rates would be adjusted as they currently are. In this option, all else would remain the same. So it'd really just be saying this is the floor. The next option would be to set a formal base amount per pupil with a corresponding uniform tax rate percentage. So the percentage that a district pays over the base amount is the percentage that its tax rate is increased. This would be structured by adjusting the funding formula to include that formal base amount, calculating a tax rate annually to ensure that sufficient revenues would be raised. And then for those districts that are spending above the formal base amount, increase their tax rates by the same percentage that the districts are spending above the base amount. And this option may result in a fluctuating minimum tax rate.
How would this work with our current weighting system, where I think like the intent behind the weights is to recognize that we need to spend different amounts to achieve the same educational outcomes across virality, poverty, ELL, student count. It seems like a base is a pretty different approach to that. It's setting a dollar amount, which would not reflect the different needs of different communities.
So that really would be a policy decision. The one thing that I think would be worth keeping in mind is when and where would the weights be applied in the formula. So if you have a base amount, it could be that the weights are then applied against that base amount or not. I mean, that would be a policy decision.
Back a little in history, one of the predecessor mechanisms was called the foundation formula. This goes back 25 years anyway. And it was calculated to mandate a certain amount directly aid to the school districts, and it was based on equalized pupils. Again, the weights were different, but the same idea.
It's actually the same way it's used sort of, but anyway, continue. I think there are a lot of differences between this idea and the foundation formula because we're still using the statewide fund to cover anything above the base. I'm curious if there's, so I think when we first asked this question a number of years ago, we were less concerned about inflationary pressures and more concerned about making sure that every district was spending adequately and not below adequately. And so I'm curious, is there a way to sort of, instead of having the base be $1, like, is there a way to use the base the same way, use the yield the same way the yield is used now, but so it defaults to something that's adequate? So the lowest is adequate?
So I think that would be getting to the first option where it would essentially be holding everything else equal and then just saying, you know, this is the minimum base amount.
Okay.
And again, I think that where weights would or would not fit into that picture is also a question. So would the base amount, is that where the weights would be applied and also used for tax capacity, or would they be used in one or the other? Would be a further question.
Representative Beckman.
You could do both too. You could have a base amount with a minimum homestead property tax rate as well.
What I struggle with here is if you suddenly impose this on the system, we don't know that the spending happening now is what the school district would consider adequate because in this particular year, everything has hit school districts. So they're looking at a high, potentially high amount of tax rate in their school district. So maybe they're not raising their spending in the way they could because they're looking at that. So I don't know which point in time, this would be to me a not right point in time to be making, to suddenly impose a new system. Problem, it's just an issue I have. I don't know, I have big issues I have.
And I think that's an important concern, and I myself struggle with making any change at all, since we don't know what's causing that downward spiral with child achievement. What really bothers me is the whole reason this system is in business. I mean, and we're failing that.
I had a question that may be in my head, part in regards to your question right now, which there's probably no easy answer at all.
I'm not totally wrong, Jim. I don't know, but it's a big question.
It's a big concern, but I also wonder, maybe it's an ed committee question. To what extent did parents help their kids with their homework these days? You
All
know,
those issues.
it's all over the place, probably.
And again, these are incredibly complex issues, right? And I don't mean to cut you off, I just mean the complexity of like what families are available now, given the state of the economy, the availability of what needs kids are coming into the classroom with, like all of that, is,
Completely agree.
administration ability, so all of that, and like, we are not gonna solve any of that in this room, unfortunately, yet we have this tax rate that we must wrestle with. Julia, yeah, it's really frustrating. I'm not frustrated, you are frustrated at the state of the challenge that we are trying to solve with inadequate information, despite staff's best efforts. Is there one G?
There's just a 1C and then there's an option 2. So we're getting there. And I do want to again reiterate that this is not me recommending any changes to the system. This is me presenting a report. So then option 1C, the final option under these mechanics for setting the yields would be to set a formal base amount and then have a corresponding uniform rate of the yield. So essentially you'd use the yield for school districts with funding greater than the base amount. Similar way to structure it here, calculate a tax rate annually to make sure that sufficient revenues are raised within the ed fund, and then have districts decide locally the amount to spend over that base amount, and then that is what would be subject to the yield. This would result in increased volatility in tax rates for districts spending above the base.
Thank you. And to me, then, I would need to know about each category of categorical aid to see how is this operating? What do we know about it? Is it the most efficient, is it the most cost effective? Which I think we should be doing anyway.
Yep. Recognizing that needs are different in different places and that whatever formula we come up with should, as best as it can, account for those.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure.
But you can have a categorical grant that it's not working well. Probably with all of the.
And in a state as small as Vermont, we should be able to identify those needs and tackle them when we see what they are. It's what, 80,000 kids, or is it less than that now? 83,000. That's Chicago, less than Chicago.
And just there's, to your point earlier about federal mandates, there's just such an interesting dynamic between local decision-making and statewide. It's like we want to create equity and consistency, and we also want to honor communities knowing what's best for them. But if at some point everything is a minimum and an allocation and a determination and an expectation that is made at a statewide level, like, are we creating a really complex system to give the illusion of local decision-making when really we've removed very little, like, most of that decision-making?
And then once that point is sort of in front of us, that reality is in front of us, there's sort of two choices. Do we lean deeper into local decision making, or do we sort of release ourselves from that story that we're telling and clarify? Yeah.
It is frustrating as on town meeting day to be given something and told that there's, obviously town meeting is not the time to weigh in because budgets are already set. And if you want to have an impact on your local decision making, you should go to all those meetings before town meeting day. But the idea that you get presented with something and said, we actually don't really have a way to impact this, so vote for it, but we don't have a way to make any changes, really.
So the other big umbrella option, option 2, would be to establish a state level funding amount for school districts with a corresponding uniform rate. So this gets back to removing total spending decisions from the local level, and would mean that school districts would receive the base amount per weighted pupil. And so and then of course, a corresponding uniform base tax rate would be calculated so that all categorical aid and base level spending could be funded through the uniform base amount. So that wraps up the second part of the report, which is mechanics for setting yields. The final piece that I was asked to touch on is just general revenue considerations and some example levers of revenues in the ed fund beyond property taxes.
So again, we can lower spending or increase revenue. Those are the two options. And Pat's in the Zoom. I don't know if you can see that.
Yes, thank you. He's in the Zoom in case there's a phone a friend, because I'm very firmly in the education fund sphere. So.
Yeah, because one thing I was thinking, and it goes to what you were saying about long-term, short-term, medium-term. There are things that we could do in the revenue side of things that could phase out or change over time as, say, we're going to do this with revenue, and we're going to do this with some new education funding formula that we do a study for, or get, or whatever. And then slowly phase the revenue out or something else as the other changes come. That's
I think that's a great point. And I think a good example of that is, we have a pretty significant reserve in the education fund that we never, ever use. It could be used in a single year, but only if it could be filled again. And it could only be filled again if we had really significant other changes happening, say, the next year. Thus far, our track record on those significant changes in the next year I don't feel heartened by them right now. That doesn't mean that there isn't still a possibility.
We've used those reserves the last 10 years. We've used those reserves for the last 10 years. They're not untouchable.
But my concern, I guess, and look, we can get deeper into this, but we've sort of artificially bought hundreds in some ways over the last many years, and so I don't want to sort of continue that cliff.
You have to throw it back up.
Right.
That's the policies.
Julia, tell us about sales tax and others.
So not at the sales tax just yet, if that's okay. We got a couple more slides about property taxes. So talking about revenues, we'll recall, again, I know I keep saying this, property taxes are adjusted based on the difference between total expenditures and non-property tax revenues. We also know that the average bill change for one property class also depends on the average bill change for another property class. So all else equal, if the average bill change is not uniform, one property class will see a larger increase to offset the other class's tax relief. And that's what I'm saying every week when we come in and looking at the Ed Fund Outlook, and I'm talking about the average bill change and talking about it's a policy decision. This is the policy decision.
We see that especially when we cap certain property tax rates, that we force other revenue sources to. Is this something we might see in play this year?
Certainly, and it will come down to, again, a policy decision in terms of how to cover that cap with the Act 127 5% tax rate cap. Homestead property taxes of districts cannot increase by more than 5%. So that amount that would have been raised by those tax rates and is not being raised by those tax rates, that needs to be paid for somewhere. And so what was in the December 1 modeling was what was written in the December 1 statute, that we had to assume the cost of that would be uniformly applied across all property tax classes, homestead, non-homestead, and income. If that what comes to play will be ultimately to the General Assembly. So that's really what this slide is just talking about, that, the average bill change is ultimately a policy decision, and providing relief for one class means all else equal, another class will need to pick it up.
And I think, as we move further along in this conversation, I think it's going to be helpful to sort of look at examples of all of that.
Sure. Considerations of the property tax credit. So we know about 2/3 of households receive a property tax credit based on their income. This credit is on a lag, meaning that it's applied to the following year's tax bill. So because of the lag, changes in the average bill impact, the way that those are felt vary by households. So households that are income sensitized are going to feel that average bill change in a different way than households that are not income sensitized because of the lag of the property tax credit.
Well, I totally understand what you just said, I do. I wonder if you had some kind of, little, here's an example to explain that without just the words in a picture.
Sure. So say you mean like on the micro level, what does it look like for a taxpayer? So say you're a taxpayer and it's FY24 and you qualify for the property tax credit. So you're under 90,000, all of those iterations. Your school district has its ed spending per pupil voted. So we're calculating what is your homestead tax liability? What is your income liability? If you would be paying less on income than on property, you get a credit for what that difference is. However, because of when the data comes into play, that credit will then be applied against next year's property tax bill. So that means that while your spending decisions of this current year are being reflected in your bill of the overall homestead liability, your property tax credit is reflecting last year. So that's where the lag comes into play. So because of that, if one year you see a very large increase in your homestead tax and the property tax credit will adjust for that, but that larger property tax credit will be applied to the following year's tax bill.
And so let's say your tax bill went up, your homestead tax bill went up a lot this year, just as a wild example, seems like a real possibility. I would be getting a credit this year based on what my tax bill was last year, and so I might not have the extra money around to figure out that difference. And I think ideas for what to do with that are certainly something we're gonna need to take on. Scott, you have some things that I mentioned.
And making sure that
Just do
people,
what every other state in New England does.
and make sure that people file their homestead declarations in the beginning to
And
even.
making sure it's yes.
Yeah, so that's exactly the point of this slide here, talking about how those big fluctuations, either up or down, in property tax bills, that property tax credit is not applied on the same year, so it's felt differently. Now I'll see if I can make that bigger.
And Julia, if you could help us in the future think sort of about the mechanics of what it would look like to do that in a single year, that would be great.
Sure. Good question. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to pull it up again. I'll try pulling it up on the committee page now. You still see my screen? So again, not policy proposals. These are example revenue levers.
This might be a little bigger.
Sure. How's that?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so this is saying preliminary revenue estimate lever. So as we know, there's increasing non-property tax revenues decreases the amount that needs to be raised from property taxes. And again, I think I've said this probably today, but because of the 5% transition provision in Act 127, there's no linear relationship between the amount of revenue from non-property tax revenue sources going into the education fund and corresponding property tax relief because of that tax rate cap. So we can't use that ballpark rule we've used in the past of a penny on both rates, $10 million because of the cap.
Yeah.
So we've got here some levers that correspond with the revenue sources that are non-property in the education fund. Larger levers get into sales and use tax and different iterations of changes to sales and use and both the rate and the base. And then smaller quote unquote levers such as changing in exemptions from the sales tax, new tax on sugar, sweetened beverages, changes to purchase and use, and meals and rooms. And cloud.
I would, that first sentence there, revenues decreases the amount that needs to be raised from property taxes unless the districts increase their spending. And when you put this revenue into our existing system without making a change to it, you're pumping the yield higher than it is now, and the districts will spend to that yield.
Thank you. I should have caveated this slide as well. All else equal.
Well, I think maybe you could get like a header for all of your PowerPoints that just says all else equal.
I understand that, but I feel like instead putting what the few words that Scott said there, because all else being equal does not trigger me to think of what Scott said just then. It's just me saying.
Well, I think Scott was describing a behavior change. Julia sort of just caveat. Does anyone have any other questions about this?
Lots more to discuss.
Well,
I guess I have a question that I thought someone else would ask, but I'll just ask it because I'm having trouble getting my head around scale. I understand what a nonlinear relationship is, but what would all else equal based on sort of the newest outlook, which does not necessarily correspond to what warrant budgets are, might be higher, might be lower, who knows? Feel nervous about that. What, like the 1% increase in statewide sales, that 88.7, like just ballpark, can you give us some sense of scale?
With respect to like average bill increase?
Yeah.
Sure. So 50 million, and this is using all of the December 1 letter assumptions, 50 million decreases the average bill change to about 15% increase instead of an 18.5% increase.
Not a lot of impact.
Say that again.
Yeah. Okay.
How much money has that minimal impact?
So 50 million. We're talking very, very ballpark preliminary modeling.
I'm just wanting everyone to get a sense of scale, and the scale could go wildly in either direction, but.
Can we,
And
let's hope for one direction rather than the other.
I think it's gonna take policy tools just to say it's in a specific direction.
yeah, so that was 5-0. Just
It's a 3%
3%.
difference in the average bill.
a 3.5, and I really do want to caution with this much money gets you this percentage because of this 5% cap, that it really depends on each district's ed spending per pupil decision and corresponding capping of rates and their grand list.
And
So
so-
it's a very, very fine line to walk. So I don't feel comfortable. I have some sense of scale because I've done different modeling runs to help wrap my head around different things here. And I don't feel like I can say, okay, if this is 15%, this is how much you need to get to 14% or 16% because of the intricacies of the cap.
And so while 50 million might be somewhere in some ballpark, doesn't mean 100 million is sort of double ballpark to that, not being a linear relationship.
Exactly. So do you want more sense of scale, or is that
I
helpful?
think that works. I think if you say too many more numbers, we might get attached to them.
We might. Cry.
I think most of what is sort of up here on the list are issues we've had at least a few minutes of testimony on before, but are there sort of items on that list that are, people have questions about?
Not on this list, but other committees that might be coming to us that would take away some of our sales tax revenue. I wonder if we have some info about that.
What does that mean?
Well, like if a committee were saying no more flavored tobacco sales, what is the hit sales excise tax on? Sales tax probably.
We'll find that out. But I will say for all of the committees, this is not a good year to go. Okay. Thank you, Julia, for this one.
Thank you, Julia. That was
Yeah.
really interesting.
So,
Oh, I'm glad.
We ask Ed Fund outlook questions?
does that feel, do you feel great with that?
Yeah, sure.
So I'm just curious to hear, understand whether you have any sense at all about how the forecasted homestead property tax rate aligns with where we might end up with 5% caps on rates. And like, yeah, sort of given what we know about where schools are at and who will reach that cap, how that relates to what's forecasted here.
Before we go to questions about the outlook, I would love to have just like a brief moment about sort of testimony for next week with everyone. So, what I was planning for next week is a deeper dive on the cap and a deeper dive on basically what happens when we shift the income homestead and non-homestead yields around. So we can understand sort of who, if we were trying to sort of protect one class of taxpayers, how would that impact another class of taxpayers in sort of some scenarios, just so we can all, Julia referenced the balloon. If folks want to really get their head around the balloon, the report on moving to a full income base has an incredibly detailed explanation of how the balloon works with a lot of graphs that sort of demonstrate the balloon. If folks want to dive into that. So those were the two things I was sort of planning for next week. It's not going to be Tuesday, actually, it's going to be Wednesday because of the governor's budget address. But are there other, I was not going to stop your question. I'm just wondering, are there other things that feel sort of like the likely next step for conversations for folks?
By cap, you mean the 5% cap that's the extra?
The 5%, 10%, 127
That's
situation.
very interesting.
And our task is to,
We're gonna have to set a tax rate for the year. That the watchers. Okay.
I think it's important for people I assume this committee knows, and maybe most legislators, but other people outside of us understand that that 5% cap is pre-CLA. And to go through those steps to show how you can get a 5% cap and still a 20% increase in your actual bill paid.
And Jill Remick is coming in early next week. Is that right, Sophie? It's Wednesday morning. Next Wednesday morning, not this Wednesday morning, to talk. We're gonna go deep on the CLA then, because I agree that's an important part of the conversation. Yes, Representative.
For several of the reasons that have come up in our discussion today, I am very nervous about not knowing, from the point of view of the Education Committee's view, what should be off our table. And I'm nervous that I may make a decision strictly with my revenue head on, not understanding or appreciating that some of these levers ought to be conditioned on the Ed Committee saying, yeah, I'm okay with that, or it's going to do this, or it's going to, I just don't know enough about that. And given the nervousness or conversation about what we're doing or not getting for achievement and where the school system's headed, I'm a little nervous that I pull a lever that I shouldn't have pulled.
So
I just don't know.
No, appreciate you articulating that. So some ideas, one, like, let's all make sure we're talking to our colleagues on the Education Committee. I'm certainly talking to the chair of the Education Committee a lot. And trying to put in place a public hearing, a House Senate Education Finance public hearing on this topic soon. And just want to, before we go to Ed Outlook questions, just want to let the folks on the benches know that I will ask you if you want to sit in the chair and say anything, or ask for about my yes, Representative Scudo.
From the list of other
Yes.
witnesses, would you include what you said before? Obviously want to like keep hearing from AOE about what we're hearing about districts and under and overweighted and the 5% total spending above 5% is looking like.
Yeah, and we're, more budgets are going to be warned very soon, and so we'll have a better, they'll be able to bring us more, less room or more warnings. Warnings about warnings.
You also mentioned the review committee being stood up. Will we hear more about?
We will.
About that?
First one over here, was it you, Tim?
Yeah, on the hearing you just mentioned. Well, is that likely to take place when we have a pretty good idea of where we're headed? Or
I don't know.
not?
What do you think?
We'll get
I think maybe both would be nice.
We're all going up.
yeah, we'll get a very different result from the public, for anybody. If we have a proposal for them to chew over, if we just say, we don't know, can you help us? You know,
Yeah.
We want to influence the conversation too.
it would help.
Representative Anthony, we could have 2 hearings.
Shape it a
Yes.
little bit.
Yeah.
After Julia has referred in her report to a phrase that came up during the debate with the Supremes in the Brigham decision called the constitutional adequate education, I have to remark, I was in a class and the professor asked, it was a betting pool, how many of you think the Supremes are going to base their opinion on the adequacy language in the Constitution, and how many do you think will base their decision on the common benefits, that is to say, equal protection language? Most of the folks in that class bet on the adequate language, but that's not what the decision was framed on. And it sent the legislature off into an equitable apportionment of spending rather than an adequacy debate of education for the next 20 years, interestingly enough.
Before we adjourn for the afternoon, I have a comment.
We're not even close to adjourning for the afternoon.
But you're welcome to say what you say.
Before we get to there, I have a comment based on what I think I heard the committee say, which I'd like to share. That's all, but it's early in the afternoon.
Okay,
You said we're not ready to adjourn.
we're not.
Okay,
Okay, cool, okay. Questions about the outlook? No one has any questions about the outlook?
What? I asked.
Yes.
Do you want to answer that question now, or do you want to?
Sure. So I think that the question was regarding the 5% cap and the rates and the outlook. And if they're reflected here.
You know, it's sort of like at some point we max out, like the majority of rates are capped on the homestead side, and then we are pushing balloons. Do you have a sense of like how close we are to maxing out any of our current rate?
Sure. So the December 1 outlook and corresponding January 9th, and this is the same modeling that we looked at last week, has the majority of school districts being capped at 5%. And the specific number, it's hard to know because the modeling is based on these very preliminary estimates from AOE. So it will depend as school budgets are warned, and we have better data in there, how it is actually looking in terms of school budgets. Because right now, we don't have the budget data to be able to say like, oh, this is how it's looking with this yield.
Oh, wait, I asked you something privately that a bunch of people had asked me. And so I just want to, this whole idea that somehow the ed fund could break. People keep on talking about it. Can you respond to that?
Sure. So I think that the concern being if all of the school districts rates are capped at 5%, then there's not going to be enough revenues. There still is the non-homestead as a flexible lever. So the whole structure of the education fund is set up in such a way where that's impossible.
The breaking is impossible.
The breaking is impossible.
Or floating in on itself, or I've heard a bunch of various words like that.
Anything that fits into that category is impossible because of the flexible lever of the non-homestead rate as well.
Thank you.
But sort of to my point, like the number of levers that we have may disappear if
Be down to one.
it'll be down to one that has to absorb.
We'll have less levers.
And like,
I'm not saying
we don't
that
know
much
whether we're
less.
at that point yet, or how much more spending it would take to.
No, I don't feel comfortable speaking to that modeling yet, just because we don't have the school district budget data.
Thank you.
Sure.
Jeff, Colin, Sue, anyone have anything they want to say at this delightful juncture in our day? Great.
I'll be right.
Jim, do you want to summarize?
What we were talking about recently with Julie was the blue chart, shall we call it, you know? Revenue levers and stuff. Nuts and bolts. Which is pretty easy, I'll say easy to get our arms around, we can see what happens. Earlier in the afternoon, a little while ago, you used the phrase, if I got it down correctly, leave ourselves at the story we're telling ourselves. When we were talking.
It's a hotline, yeah.
That's a whole different discussion, and I find it fascinating. Although depending on how we manage it, it can be somewhat of a rat hole, rabbit hole. And it's fascinating for a number of reasons, but I don't know where we go with it. So,
I appreciate that you said rabbit hole because I actually just saw these very sweet bunnies I saw hopping across the snow yesterday as I was sort of getting ready for today, so I appreciate that.
well,
Peace in the middle of all
it's
this.
fascinating. We could have a conversation over coffee about some of that stuff, or just, and I need to step out for just.
No, I think we are done for the day.
Okay, good.
I know that was a lot of content.
So what?
So encourage folks to even just, let it soak in, because we're gonna need to make
Right.
some big decisions.